is Dr. Nasong'o. Are you here? Your very handsome photograph is already here.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I have just a few comments to make, and my focus is on the scourge of corruption. Whereas we have this COVID-19 as the current pandemic that we are dealing with, there is a scourge that has been on for a long time, known as corruption. And corruption has had a major impact on issues of development and governance, not only just on the African continent, but elsewhere. Research on the question of corruption distinguishes between bureaucratic corruption and political corruption. Political corruption has to do with the stealing of election, of the electoral process and so on, but bureaucratic corruption is what I want to focus on. And what's available indicates that there are four categories of corruption. If we are going to fight it, then we need to have a clear understanding of how it is manifested. And the first category of corruption is what is known as cost-reducing corruption. And these are actions by civil servants to reduce the regulation-induced costs of an enterprise. For example, by exempting of private businesses from tax obligations. And the funds saved in this way then are shared between the bureaucrat and the farm owner. The second type of corruption is cost-enhancing corruption, which essentially involves extraction of bribes from entrepreneurs seeking licenses, including import-export, as well as investment licenses. And the public procurement domain in Africa is the arena in which cost-enhancing corruption has been most pervasive. Number three is benefit-enhancing corruption. This is where bureaucrats permit more public benefits, more public funds, more development resources to accrue to an individual or a group of individuals than is legally permitted. Now, the recipients of such benefits then share them with the bureaucrat based on a prearranged formula. The fourth category is benefit-reducing corruption. This is where bureaucrats simply appropriate for themselves public benefits, public resources that are intended for the general public. What is interesting is that for the most part, the governments on the continent have actually outlawed corruption, yet it has grown in leaps and bounds over the decades. Available evidence indicates that in the 1960s through the 1970s, bureaucrats tended to just demand kickbacks valued at 10% of the total cost of, say, a public tender, of the total cost of a development project, or of the total cost of whatever public service is being procured. By the 1980s through the 1990s, the kickback demands had actually escalated to 40% of the value of a development project, the value of a public goods being procured, the value of public services being procured. By the 2000s to the present time, in fact, kickback demands have maxed out to 100%. This involves situations where a development project is planned, it is costed, it is valued, it is paid for, but nothing completely happens, but the money is paid out. So that's 100% in terms of this. And the cost of this is very enormous. Available evidence indicates that it increases the cost of goods by an average of 20%. It deters investment and it holds back development, therefore. Now, if statistics by Transparency International are anything to go by, they indicate that 7 of the 10 most corrupt countries in the world are African countries. according to the African Union, in a study conducted in 2002, corruption costs sub-Saharan African countries $148 billion annually. And the problem is that these $148 billion are actually shipped out of the continent. And so they are deposited in offshore accounts, therefore helping develop the economies of already developed countries. It will make a huge difference if the proceeds of this corruption will be reinvested on the continent, especially within productive enterprises, including manufacturing. It will make a huge difference, but this is not the case. Now, what again is interesting is that whereas 148 billion is shipped out to offshore accounts, the total amount received by sub-Saharan African countries in terms of development aid is only 22.5 billion annually. What this means then is that if corruption is tamed, we do not even need foreign aid. This is a very significant point. Now, it is true that most of these countries have put in place strategies to fight corruption. And as I have already mentioned, corruption is outlawed in virtually all the countries. Yet all these strategies have not actually made any impact in terms of containing the malice of corruption. Legal approaches have been employed, including legislating against corruption and prescribing legal penalties for the same. Political approaches have been used, including establishing anti-corruption commissions, corruption cleanup organizations, and so on. Social approaches have been employed, including training and sensitization on moral, ethical values, and on issues of personal integrity. Yet, in spite of all these strategies that have been employed, the problem of corruption has grown by leaps and bounds, as I've already mentioned, from 10% to 40% to 100%. And so the question then becomes, why is it that in spite of all these strategies, social, political, legal, the problem persists? My findings are that there is just one major thing, one major factor, that there is a total lack of political will to actually stem the scourge of corruption. There is no political will to fight it. And so anti-corruption efforts are a mere smokescreen. They are just responses to demands either by donors, by external investors, by the general public to do something about corruption. So the political leadership wants to be seen to be doing something when in actuality, they do not have the political will to do so. Now, my normal example of one of the best countries that can be used to indicate that it is possible to stem out corruption is a country called Singapore. Singapore got its independence from Britain around 1959, the same time, around the same time as most of the African countries were gaining their independence. Ghana in 1957, Sudan in 1956, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya 63, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and the country also remained under an authoritarian system with a single party rule. But they were firmly committed to fighting corruption. And right now, for a long time, I think since the mid-1980s, Singapore is one of the most clean countries in terms of corruption. And the lessons from Singapore, therefore, indicate that one way of ensuring success in the war against corruption is the importance of political will. That no one should be spared, that the law should strictly be applied without favor. And Singapore has demonstrated this, that leading political leaders, including cabinet ministers, party officials, once they are seen to be corrupt, they are dealt with effectively. The second lesson is that one needs to employ a comprehensive anti-corruption strategy that incremental measures won't do. And this is what has been the problem with most of the strategies employed by most of our African governments. So the strategy must be comprehensive enough to seal all loopholes and eliminate incentives and opportunities for corruption. They have to make corruption a high-risk, low-reward enterprise. And this is what has obtained in the case of Singapore. Number three, there is need to pay special attention to government departments that are vulnerable to corruption. And these include customs, immigration, internal revenue, and the traffic police. And these are the departments that are seen to be perhaps the most corrupt because of the available opportunities for the same. And so Singapore's anti-corruption success is attributed to its dual strategy of reducing both the opportunities and the incentives for corruption. But most African leaders, however, only pay lip service to the war on corruption. In fact, the case of the COVID-19 pandemic has actually provided a major opportunity for corrupt leaders to amass wealth, proceeds from finances and funds and resources provided for fighting the coronavirus. In one case, there is a Minister of Health who, in accounting for millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars provided to fight coronavirus, in 1 month, he tabulated the expenditure. And one of the items was an expenditure on official tea. And in 1 month, they had spent $40,000 on tea and snacks. They had spent $90,000 on photocopying. And so there was a major outcry that this cannot be the true picture of things. So that then even the proceeds, the resources that are available for fighting the coronavirus are simply lining the pockets of individual leaders. And so the anti-corruption war is waged half-heartedly, where low-level corrupt officials are the ones who are prosecuted, while perpetrators of grand corruption are celebrated and cleared to run for political office. And the problem again is that even the half-hearted anti-corruption war, in most cases, it's weaponized and it is deployed against political opponents, which then creates a cycle, so that then the political opponents who are victimized for corruption and others left out, when they assume power, they also use the anti-corruption war to victimize those who had victimized them. In the meantime, corruption goes on unabated. And so perhaps what we need to do is that there is need for an anti-corruption movement in most of these countries, especially a movement generated from below. Because the reality is that strategies that have been designed from above have not been effective in dealing any dent against the war on corruption. And so we need to mobilize from below to be able to demand that those involved in corruption are actually held accountable. And it is only in that way, perhaps, that the political leaders will see sense in actually engaging in a genuine anti-corruption war. Otherwise, as it is, the pandemic will ensure that development will remain a mirage, that good governance will remain a mirage. And in fact, the violations of human rights have a lot to do with this kind of corruption. Those are my comments. Thank you. You are muted, Sam. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. I keep doing that to myself. Anyway, Mary, would you like me to have the question for Catherine now so that she can move on with her day? Catherine, are you still here? I think she's not here right now. So let's move forward. Thank you for Dr. Shadrack and
Dr.
Catherine, there
sorry,
you are.
I am here. I'm so sorry. Dr.
No problem.